What if the only way to survive the next decades is to cool the planet? Not metaphorically. I ask this literally. Because despite record-breaking wildfires, floods, and heat waves, emissions continue to rise and action continues to stall. The truth, we know the science for 30 years. We have had the tools, treaties, and technology, yet we are still waiting. And now, as a result, some leaders are quietly asking, should we start cooling Earth ourselves?
And some are saying that we need to then cool the planet, perhaps as a temporary emergency measure until we complete.
The problem isn't just technology, it's trust, governments, and moral responsibility. And if we get this wrong, if we act too fast or wait too long, we may trigger consequences far worse than the warming we are trying to fix.
Cooling the planet. And some scientists say, yes, we can and we should. And others are saying we should not act like gods.
So, what would it take to govern a global thermostat? Who gets to decide how much cooling is enough and what's too much?
And then once, even if we do decide, who is going to set the global thermostat? Maybe your country.
In this episode, I speak with Janos Pasztor, former UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, advisor to Ban Ki-moon, and Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. For nearly 5 decades, he stood at the front line of global climate diplomacy, quietly shaping the conversations behind closed doors. But before we dive in, one quick note. If this episode sparks a new perspective or even just makes you pause, consider following the show, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone you respect. Every single action from the listeners helps the team reach more minds, attract more world-class guests, and bring you conversations that matter at the level you think. The more momentum we build, the deeper we can go. If you're ready to hear what world leaders are only just beginning to discuss and why the next climate decision might change the course of history, this conversation is for you. And usually people like it. Janos, it's really good to have you on the podcast and on the show. And I love diving into this, I think, this hot topic, climate change. And since you're the expert and I'm no expert in that space, I can take the role of a devil's advocate, because when I look at social media these days, I have these two perspectives. One is pro and the other one is contra. And I hope with you that you can help me understand the space better, because you are really, really deep into this area. And let me start with the first question to you. What's been on your mind recently when you think about climate change?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this podcast. And I really look forward to the conversation we're going to have today on a topic that is very challenging. And you asked what's been on top of my mind. Well, what's been on the top of my mind is that global emissions of carbon dioxide continue to rise, and so do the average global temperatures. So do the impacts, the increasingly significant and sometimes catastrophic impacts of this climate warming. And the world is not ready. It's happening. It's going to be worse. Governments, intergovernmental processes, and also non-state actors are simply not addressing this issue at all, or not sufficiently. So when you put all this together, it worries me, and that's what's on my mind.
Is it really that bad?
It is pretty bad. It is pretty bad in the sense that, I mean, just look around what's happening in the world in terms of impacts. Forget the numbers, the 1.5 degree or 2 or whatever, but look at the impacts. Not so long ago, a third of Pakistan was under water, and it was flooded because before it there was drought. It hardened the soil, and then came the flash floods, which couldn't be absorbed by the soil. Look at the wildfires in Los Angeles. Look at the drought in South Africa and in Brazil. These things are all happening, and science is increasingly good at saying to what extent climate change is maybe not necessarily the cause, but has certainly contributed to the intensity or the magnitude, or even sometimes the frequency of these issues. So this is how bad it is, and this is how bad it is at 1.3 degrees increase of average global temperatures over historical. And it's going to go a lot higher. It's now looks like it's going to go to something like 2.6 to 3.1 degrees, according to the UN Environment Programme's estimates, which were, of course, analyzed before the US elections. And maybe we'll talk about that at some point, the impacts on climate change. But there is a lot. So that's the current state of affairs. And so when you put all the impacts together, put where we're heading as a world, then frankly, it is quite worrying. And actually, I would add to it one more, because what I see, what one sees is this level of impacts, and the fact that emissions are still rising, and then you see that even the good countries in terms of climate response are actually not doing really enough. But then there are some that are actually beginning to go backwards at a time when we should be going forwards even faster. So when you put all these together, it is quite worrying, and it's something that certainly makes me worried, and I'm not the only one.
One question before I continue with the other questions. Are you fine to pull also recent political events into our conversation? Because you said we can talk about a little bit later how the US elections plays into climate change. Is this okay with you?
Of course I am. I mean, these are very important issues that have to be addressed.
Super, that's good. For the listeners who want to jump off quickly from this live stream and say, okay, 5 minutes, I have had enough, I come back maybe later. What are the three core messages that you want them to remember?
Okay, so I think in terms of 3 points, first of all, we really have to accelerate mitigation, that is to say, emission reductions, carbon capture and storage, and even carbon dioxide removal, but substantially, and do it much faster. So that's one. So to actually reduce the problem to start with of putting more greenhouse gases. The second one is that we also have to really substantially accelerate adaptation to what's coming, recognizing that there are limits to adaptation. And then the third, and this is important, and we'll talk about the details later, I presume, but we have to consider whether the time has come to start cooling parts or the whole planet until we finish the decarbonization of this world. That's a question that is very difficult, but something we need to deal with. So emission reductions accelerate. Secondly, adaptation we have to accelerate. And thirdly, think about whether or not we should start cooling the planet.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, especially the last one. So it's all about decarbonization, basically. This is one of the root causes of the problem. What I enjoyed when I prepared our episode was this one sentence that you used in the preparation material that I pulled into the title of our recording of our live stream. It's the Inconvenient Truth 2.0. Can you explain for our listeners what you mean with this term?
Yeah, so some of the listeners may be old enough to remember Al Gore's film, The Inconvenient Truth. And that was quite some time ago now. And at that time, the focus of the film was, is there climate change? And if there is, who is doing it? And what are the things we can do about it? So, and there was a lot of a lot of positive reactions to that movie, but there were also a lot of negative reactions to that movie. And he was trying to say that this issue of climate change is inconvenient. We don't want to talk about it. Now, many years later, we have come to a new situation. While there are still climate deniers, and that's a real problem, but fundamentally, the world has accepted climate change and, broadly speaking, the kinds of things to do about it. But this issue that we're talking about here is not being talked about. And I say this is like Inconvenient Truth 2.0 because governments and other leaders, they don't feel comfortable talking about these issues. Maybe because they don't see the solutions, maybe because they have invested so much in simply talking about reaching 1.5 degrees centigrade, and we'll come to that perhaps of what that means. But they're so focused on this that they're unable to or unwilling to go beyond and say clearly, we're heading to problematic warming and we need to deal with it. It's inconvenient. They're not sure what to do about it. So I call it Inconvenient Truth 2.0.
Is it really that long ago, this movie? Al Gore, I think this was 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was early 90s. I don't ask me for the exact year, but it's a long time ago.
Yeah, in the early 90s, I was in middle school. So it's
Mhm.
basically,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I was already on working on the climate issues, but anyway, that was quite some time ago.
So you have,
A lot of things have changed since then.
that's what, can we make a run through about the political perception of climate change? You have decades of experience in that space, especially working with governments. How has the handling of the topic climate change changed from the late 80s up to 2025?
So everything has changed. Really, and not just in those decades, but even if I look back just in the last 10 years since the Paris Agreement, so much has changed. And I think it's difficult to go through everything, but maybe a couple of examples. So let me start with the US, because the US is a key actor. It is still the largest, one of the largest emitters worldwide, and certainly per capita basis, it has the technology, the money. So potentially, it's a super important country. If you look back a little bit to the history, the older George H.W. Bush was the one who signed and got the UN Framework Convention Treaty ratified. So it was a Republican president.
Mhm.
Then, some years later, his son, George W. Bush, did not even try to get the Kyoto Protocol ratification in the Senate. They just simply didn't say that they were not going to do that. And I think since the Kyoto Protocol, things have gone quite a bit downhill. Then, in this period, we have increasingly visible, strong, uh, and effective climate deniers who have an impact. And these climate deniers are well organized and they are well funded. And there's good evidence to this, documented evidence of what is happening. But they have been having a very strong impact. And then we got to the Paris Agreement, which in fact was quite a weak agreement, but it was the best thing we could achieve at that time. And then it gets even worse during the first phase, Trump's first presidency. U.S. leaves the Paris Agreement. Then Biden comes back and makes a real effort to try. And for the first time, actually, America really started doing something positive on to fight climate change. And then comes Trump for the second time. He leaves the Paris Agreement again and really is trying to turn the clock and the history backward. For example, on renewable energy and on coal use and things like that. So
Okay.
this is just the US. And then we have, let's just take another country, China, rather important country, another uh, big emitter. It's the absolute largest emitter as a country, not on a per capita basis. And I remember at the beginning of the UN negotiations, China used to have one or two delegates, while countries like the US had many, many. Now China has the largest delegation to the UN Framework Convention meetings. And China has a clear long-term strategy on climate change and is actually implementing that strategy. And it's not perfect. I don't want to put it that way, but it's been in place for some time and they're moving forward and they're implementing it. And in that, as part of that strategy, China has become the absolute world leader on photovoltaics, on wind, on electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's quite a contrasting development if I can look at the G2, the two large countries. Now, the third example I think is linked to what I just said about China, but it's the price of solar photovoltaics. So photovoltaic electricity is so much lower than anybody thought it would be the case, so that it has actually become pretty much the cheapest technology available in most countries. Not everywhere. In some of the developing countries, the risk factor comes in, and so that makes it a bit more expensive. But generally speaking, solar electricity is the cheapest technology today, and that's fantastic. The problem is, of course, it's not enough because electricity is only some 10% or something of the total energy use. So we still have the others. We need to either electrify everything else, or we have that other problem. And then I take one more example, and that's the economic and political realignments in the world. Look at how Asia, for example, has evolved over the last decade or two into massive economic power and also increasing political strength. And and in a sense, it is, it's not necessarily true that, let's say, Europe or North America have absolutely fallen down, but certainly relatively, the relative political economic weight has moved to Asia. And I think that has a significant impact on the way we look at climate and the way we deal with climate change as well.
I have two questions and one remark to the part that you just said. I mean, China is pretty impressive. I did a trip to China was 2016, and it was so interesting. I had this picture of 1989 China that went through the newspaper with students fighting against the army, and China was portrayed as a poor development region. And this was the picture from school that I carried with me for decades. And then I traveled to China. It was Shanghai, Guangzhou, so this area. And we arrived in a hotel in the night, and I just used the elevator. I was tired. I think it was 2 a.m. something. Went to bed. In the morning, I got up, opened the curtains, and looked down and thought, oh, this is pretty high. It's a pretty high building. And then just started looking up, and there was an even higher building. And it felt to me, it was a trip to the future in 2016 already. Just when I looked around in China, mobile phones, it felt to me they're far ahead technological-wise. And it's a huge country, and the adoption towards solar, wind is impressive, but also nuclear. Is this perception right when we talk about China, that China puts a lot of effort into advancing its technology and becoming climate neutral? Is this the right perception of the country?
I think it is. I mean, I am a frequent visitor to China. I'm doing some lecturing and some other activities, universities and so on. But I've been following the developments in China since 1987, actually. And every time I go back, I say, "Oh my God, what happened here? It's changed completely." And even within a period of 6 months, you go back and you find a change. So I remember. Last year, 2024, in April, I spent 2 weeks in China, and I remember coming out of the Shanghai railway station, and how many electric cars I saw. The electric cars have a green number plate, so it's very easy to identify them. I was there back in November, same place, same railway station. You come out, and you only see electric cars. Nothing else. This is the kind of change that you see in such a short time. But coming back to the strategy, so China has a clear strategy to go on this green technology, renewable, circular. That's what they're working on, and that's what the central government and the local governments are trying to make happen. It's not perfect, and they have some big problems. For example, coal use is still pretty high, and it hasn't gone down, and that's a big problem. And they have to find a political way, economic way, other ways. But nevertheless, they have this clear strategy forward, and it's fantastic, and you see the results.
So China has a clear strategy forward. Let's work a little bit on the problem you mentioned before. We talked about the US and the shift in US politics from the old George W. Bush, who was, as a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
pro, let's say, environmental friendly. Then it changed completely with Biden, came back, and then Trump.
Mm-hmm.
When I, as a not so well informed person about all these climate issues, open social media these days, I have these two extremes. I have these really two extremes. On one side, I have these climate deniers, as you mentioned. They have pretty rational arguments, and then I go to another profile, and let's. Is there a specific term for people who believe in climate change that you use professionally? The climate change believers. I never thought about the term, but they're pretty pro, and they also have good arguments. And then I'm in the middle, and I try to understand. I say, okay, where do we stand in all of this? What's the real
Yeah.
impact that we are causing as a human race, and where should we start? I don't know who I should believe. Is it this
Mm-hmm.
side who says climate change will lead to the extinction of human race, or is it the other side who says, don't worry, we can continue as we do, nothing will happen? What's the reality?
Yeah. So I think the reality is, as always, more complex. But I would, first of all, I'd like to start with one thing you said. I don't think we should look at this as two equal sides and we're in the middle of this, or you're in the middle, that there is equal number of people who believe and equal number of people who deny climate change. So I think that's not the case. And I don't believe it ever was the case. We've had a long period in the media, for example, they have to look at both sides, right? So you get a sense that you have one side here, one side there, and they're the same size, or that's so it's not the case. I think when I look at the world as a whole, I think the large majority of the people and of the governments and the private sector also, first of all, are clear that there is something called anthropogenic climate change, i.e., climate change caused by human activity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think there is I can't give you a number at a global level, but it is a very small minority who would be a climate denier. Unfortunately, some of them are quite active in certain political parties in certain countries, but nevertheless, it's a very small part. Now, where the diversions begin to happen is what are we going to do about it? How significant you look at a potential future challenge to the environment, to the economy? How much do you discount it? These kinds of questions, and there are differences between people and between economic theories, between practical cultures, and so on and so forth. And that's okay, and we can discuss that in society, right? That's not I have my own personal views, and my neighbor has his or her personal views, and so on. But and it's we have countries that their governments have evolved certain views based on the societies that they represent, and that's okay. That's okay to have differences, and eventually we will find ways to move forward in ways that society can accept it. But I don't think there are too many people who are climate deniers.
Okay. When how should I phrase that? But why is there so loud discussion on social media? It looks to me that we have these two sides,
Yeah.
but I believe what you say. But why is there so much confusion about the way forward? Should we do
Yeah.
this? Should we do that? Where does this come from?
Well, this is where I think, again, there may be a small minority of climate deniers, but they're well organized and they're well funded, and they put a lot of information into social media and elsewhere. And that has an impact. That's one. The other is that there are perfectly okay and acceptable differing views on how do you interpret current risk and future risk, and what do you do now versus the future about that risk? There are different ways of doing that, and it's not easy. And it requires conversation, it requires certain political processes, it requires money that has to be put aside. Even if it's some of those win-win solutions, the win-win solutions can only happen if you put some investment up front to make it happen. And maybe eventually the overall impact will still be positive to society and low cost or negative cost even to society, but you still have to make it happen. And there are normal debates about it. I think it's true for everything else. I mean, look at the political situation today in the world. Just look at the Ukraine-Russian situation currently as we speak. There are completely different ways of looking at why the war started. We know who started the war, but why? What were the reasons behind it? And people have different views, and we just have to work that out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When we stay with climate change, because I think we can dedicate another podcast to the Ukraine-Russian situation.
Okay, I'm not sure if that's my forte, but it has an impact on climate as well. So, but let's focus on the climate issue. Yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the production of new weaponry has a tremendous impact, and as far as I understand, also the armed vehicles are not very much climate friendly. Which leads me to the next question. When we are looking at the world leaders, I mean, people need to come together, politicians and business leaders, and find a solution. Do we have, I mean, do we have a forum where they can really meet and discuss solutions, or is this happening on social media? What would be the best solution in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, we do have one multilateral intergovernmental forum, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, which has its annual big gatherings, the Conference of the Parties, or the COPs, as they are referred to, and so on. And that is really a forum where countries can come together, they can discuss, they can talk, and sometimes they even make decisions. So we have that at the multilateral level. But that's not the only forum where those issues are discussed. We have regional fora, some intergovernmental, some other kind of fora. We also have fora where it's more based on political economics. So we have the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation for Development, where these issues are discussed. We have the African Ministerial Conference of the Environment. We have the Climate Vulnerable Forum of the more vulnerable developing countries talking about the impacts of climate change. So there are lots of fora where these issues are discussed from different perspectives. And so we have enough fora. That's not the challenge. I think that the challenge is how to make better use of the fora that we have, the different fora, because all of them are needed, not one or the other. All of them are needed, and we have to make sure that we make the best use of these fora so that we can actually advance on the solutions.
This is a good point when we talk about solutions. What I very often miss, I mean, when I look at Europe, for example, I work with scientists and with deep tech companies, and Europe has a pristine framework for advancing science. When it comes to the solution side, translating science into useful products and commercialize them, because at the end of the day, you need to sell it, I have my doubts that Europe is the best place to be for entrepreneurs. When I transfer this understanding to climate change, I would say, okay, I mean, it's good that we have this fora where people can discuss and talk about, but what about the translation of goals into practice? How do you see the world in translating what's discussed in forum and what actually happens then on the other side?
Actually, it's interesting that you raised this about Europe. I think Europe is the one region which has actually translated the discussions and the agreements in the intergovernmental fora into very practical actions. Mm-hmm. And Europe may be less important today than it was yesterday, and may become even less important tomorrow in terms of the overall scheme of things. But I think it's fair to say that Europe has been a leader on translating these overall ideas into practical things to reach net zero emissions, to set up a carbon market and to have targets and achieving those targets for renewable energy use and things like that. So it's there may be other places which can produce. Smartphones and artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of that stuff happening in the world. But I think it's fair to say that Europe has been a fairly good student, if I can put it this way, when it comes to addressing the climate impacts and the solutions to the climate crisis. How that will proceed in the future, we will have to see. But I agree with you that the crucial point here is that governments come together and they discuss and they come up with either general guidelines or sometimes specific requirements. Like the Kyoto Protocol had specific emission reduction requirements for the developed country parties to the protocol, which then countries have to achieve, but they have to convert these into national laws and then legislation and market signals and all of that. And then it can be successful.
So climate change needs to do something about it, and it's good that people have this forum to discuss, and Europe is pressing forward. But when it comes from the economic side, and I would just say but and play the devil's advocate, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that I learn what's a better direction. But when I just think about Europe and say, okay, if we are the only ones implementing the measures and move forward, of course, it has an impact on the economy. I mean, when we look at the energy prices for several reasons, but one is climate change, the energy price will be higher. I mean, the fair cost will be higher. And when another region, let's say like the US says, okay, let's screw it, we don't do that, we are in an economic disadvantage, which means economic advantage, disadvantage, and our voice will not have so much impact in future. What can we do? What practical measures can be set that the nations move in sync forward, and not one presses forward has the negative sides and the others benefit from not doing it?
Yeah, so you raised a really important point, and if your starting point is different, it's very difficult to move in a synchronized way, right? Because some people have to catch up, and some people are already way ahead in a good or bad way. Okay, so this is the what makes the intergovernmental discussions and negotiations both beautiful and very difficult. Because it's beautiful in the sense that you recognize that countries have different starting points, different economic development, also different natural givens. I mean, if you're in Saudi Arabia, you put your finger in the sand and you get oil. And they have lots of it. Okay, there are countries where you put your finger in the ground and there's nothing there. Okay, so these are the realities of the world. So what has been happening in the intergovernmental discussions is to find a way, an acceptable way, acceptable to 194 parties to the treaty, to have an acceptable way to say, okay, we're not starting at the same place, but ultimately in the long term, we have the same long-term objective. How do you create a path that eventually gets us to the climate objectives, but does it in a just way and in a way that keeps everybody engaged and it keeps people moving forward? Now, this agreement is in place. It's not perfect by any means. Don't misunderstand me. It needs a lot of work and a lot of improvements and so on, but it's there. That was the fundamental part of the original treaty signed in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. A broad, if you could think of this as a north-south bargain, that the North would provide resources and technology and start reducing emissions to allow the global South to catch up, to provide technologies for them to also eventually reduce emissions. That was the basic deal. The problem is, of course, that in the meantime, things haven't happened fast enough. So there's a lot more impacts. Now there are already damages to those countries. How do you compensate for that? So there's need for resources. So it gets a bit more complicated, right? But that is the fundamental deal at the international level, is to find this just path forward that keeps people moving toward the goal. And it's not easy. And then in the meantime, the position of countries on this path changes. And China is a perfect example. When the UNFCCC negotiations started, or when at the beginning, just after the entry into force, China was clearly a developing country. It's hard to say that China today is a developing country. Okay, so things change, and also there were groups of countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc, and so on. All of that has disappeared. Some of them are now members of the EU. You know, the geopolitics has changed, and therefore the path has become a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I was just smiling when in the 90s we had in school this practice to practice speaking in front of an audience and just what you read in the newspaper and make a small speech around it. And I found this article about China and the economic opportunity in China. It was, I think, an article of 1992, 1993. So the assumption of this journalist was China is a developing country, but they will catch up soon. So you have this huge economic opportunity. I presented this to the class. Some people were laughing and said, I mean, look, it's a developing country. When you grow 0%, it's still 0%. So this will not have an impact. When I look at China today, even this was the perception of kids. We were 16, 17 years old back then, and kids are pretty honest. And when I look at China today in 2025, I would say it's the biggest economic power. And I think in some areas it might already outpace the United States. And this explains probably the tension between these two regions. It's really, in 3 decades, a lot changes.
But I think it's also important that we don't just focus on China. There are many other countries that are not as big, or some as big. I mean, look at India. It's also it's a much poorer country still, but the kinds of things that they are working on in a very different political environment than, let's say, China. And I'm not saying which is better or worse, but it is different. And they are moving forward. Massive investments in solar energy and nuclear, by the way, and so on. And then you have the Malaysias, the Indonesias. Indonesia is pretty soon going to be the 4th largest economy.
Oh, really?
Yes. So we're talking about big numbers, and then there is Thailand, and there's Vietnam, and so on. So there's just so much change, and that's part of the path that makes this both interesting and challenging.
So it's this whole region: China, South Korea, North Korea, China, Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, India. This is really advancing. So this whole area.
Well, they are. I think the Asian region is particularly important because of the total numbers involved. When you add India, China, Indonesia together, you got, I don't know, half of mankind. Not quite, but it's huge. But look at some of the countries in the Middle East. Again, it's not a question of saying it's good or bad approach, but look at what's happening in UAE. I'm heading to Qatar next week, and look at what's happening in Doha and the levels of investment and the change. It's incredible. So the world is moving, and this whole picture of third world and developing countries and all of that is it's not completely gone. There are still a lot of very poor countries, and we need to think about that because their capacities are lower. But it's still even those poor countries, like in some, let's say Africa is an interesting case where you can look at it and say, well, there's still a lot of poverty. Yes, it's true, but it's also a tremendous economic growth potential with all the young people coming in the market. And if just countries can find good ways to move forward, that can be a tremendous growth potential in that whole area. So again, I'm not an economist, but what I see is just huge changes in the world, and all of those have impacts on the climate. First of all, negative in the sense that it's growth in energy consumption, and a lot of it has been fossil fuel based. So now what we need to make sure is that as much of that new growth is not fossil, but renewable energy based. And then hopefully some of the existing fossil is over time replaced by the low and zero carbon technologies.
Yeah, economic growth. I mean, the upside is that we reduce poverty globally, and from what you said, it seems that we did, as a human race, a pretty good job to advance the poorest regions in the world. But the downside is climate change. So,
yeah, the cost has been a tremendous improvement in economic well-being of people everywhere in the world. There are exceptions, of course, but I'm talking about broadly average. But the cost is it's not just climate, actually, there are a few others. There is the biodiversity crisis, the species loss, there's land use challenge, very big issues with land use and land degradation, freshwater, oceans. I mean, you name it. Some call it the polycrisis, where there are all these interacting crises that are taking place, and the solutions to any one of these issues cannot be looked at in isolation because it's actually linked. So the cost to the economic development has been this so-called polycrisis.
I mean, our value chains, when I look from the economic side, the Western value chains, so basically the value chains that we work with today, evolved in the 50s or 60s of the last centuries after World War II. And the job back then was feed the people, especially here in Europe, when people starve, have nothing to eat, have no houses, can't pay the rent, no electricity, especially in Switzerland or in Austria or in Hungary in winter, not being able to heat the house. People are pretty unhappy, and when they are unhappy, they do stupid things like starting wars. It's optimized, I think, for a population of 2, 3, 4 billion people in the world. And now we're at 8, 9 billion people. Do you think that our technology and technology advancement can make up that we optimize our value chains in a way that we don't strain the resources of our planet in terms of climate change? Because this, as you said, it's a huge crisis, and I think one of the elements are just 8, 9, 10 billion people.
Well, first of all, if I didn't believe that it's possible to do that, I wouldn't be here talking about these issues, right? So I do believe that it's possible, and I think the problem is not the 8 or soon 9, 10 billion people that we will have. First of all, let's be clear that it's actually plateauing off. So not such a distant future, our problem, again, at the global level, is going to be the reduction in not just the growth, but even in the absolute number of people and how societies will deal with that demographic change. So, but for now, it's still growth, and but mind you, only in Africa. All the other regions of the world have now essentially stopped growing. So we know that we will plateau relatively soon. But the problem is not the number of people. The problem is how they interact with nature and resources, and a newborn in the United States will use a lot more resources than a newborn in Chad. That's the reality of our world today, and so the challenge is how to make sure that processes that are needed for societies, for people to live, to eat, to produce goods, are as much as possible reducing their resource requirements, their energy requirements, and so on. And that's the challenge that we face. So it's not the actual numbers of the people, but how much the resources they use and how one can adjust that.
I definitely think that when I look at my life, I was born in 74, and we had no computers in the house back then. So I believe that the resource consumption of an Austrian in the 70s average person was much lower than today. When I look at my house today, we have a Zoom call. We use telephone. I have iPad, iPhone, also smartphones, AirPods. I have a computer, another laptop. So the resource consumption is much higher. I'm aware that this is negative for the climate in total, but when you start asking me, okay, how much do you want to reduce that? I was saying nothing, nothing. Don't take anything away from me.
But let's be careful here. So, do you care about the total energy